Margaret Lincoln stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning rain streak down the glass. At 75, she still got up at 6:30 every morning, just like she had for the past 50 years. Some habits, she thought with a small smile, never die. But lately, other things seemed to be dying. Yesterday, she'd spent 20 minutes looking for her reading glasses, only to find them on top of her head. Last week, she'd forgotten her neighbor's name, sweet Mrs. Chun, who had lived next door for 8 years. And just this morning, she'd stood in the grocery store holding a can of tomatoes, completely unable to remember what recipe she'd planned to make. "It's just normal aging," her daughter Linda kept saying during their weekly phone calls. But Maggie could hear the worry creeping into Linda's voice. The way conversations now included subtle questions about whether she was eating properly, taking her medications, remembering to lock the doors. The worst part wasn't the forgetting itself. It was the way people looked at her when it happened. That mixture of pity and fear, as if they were staring at their own future. At the doctor's office, the young nurse spoke louder and slower, as if being 75 automatically meant being deaf and simple. At the bank, the teller asked if she needed help counting her money. Even her own son, David, had started explaining things she'd known for decades, like she was a child again. Maggie poured herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, where she'd eaten breakfast for 32 years. The rain was getting heavier. She needed to go to the Social Security office today to sort out a problem with her Medicare paperwork, and then to the bank to deposit her pension check. Important things. Adult things. The kind of things she'd been handling just fine for decades. She gathered her purse, the manila folder with her documents, and headed for the door. Then she stopped. Umbrella. She'd need an umbrella. But where was it? She checked the hall closet, then the coat closet, then the garage. 15 minutes later, she was standing in her living room, frustrated and slightly out of breath. The umbrella was nowhere to be found. "Forget it," she muttered. "It's just water." The bus ride to downtown took 40 minutes. Maggie sat near the front, watching the city change outside the windows. When she was young, this area had been full of family shops, Murphy's Hardware, Romano's Deli, the Five and Dime where she'd bought her first lipstick in 1965. Now it was all chain stores and coffee shops with names she couldn't pronounce. Back in the 80s, she and her late husband Frank used to drive down here every Saturday. Frank would browse the record store while she looked at clothes. They'd always end up at Woolworth's lunch counter, sharing a piece of apple pie and talking about their dreams. Frank wanted to retire early and travel. She wanted to learn photography and maybe write a book. But there had been other dreams too, one she'd almost forgotten. In high school, she'd been fascinated by Asian cultures, spending hours at the library reading about Japan, China, and Korea. Her math teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had caught her sketching Japanese characters in the margins of her algebra homework and called her silly for wasting time on foreign nonsense when she should focus on practical subjects. "Girls like you need to think about realistic careers," Mrs. Henderson had said, "not silly fantasies about exotic places." So Maggie had buried those dreams, choosing the practical path of business school and steady employment. She'd planned to travel to Japan someday, maybe learn calligraphy, explore the temples she'd seen in National Geographic. But life had other plans: Frank's job, the mortgage, raising Linda and David, then Frank's illness and her years as his caregiver. Somewhere along the way, that curious girl who'd dreamed of cherry blossoms and ancient traditions had gotten lost in responsibilities and expectations. "We've got all the time in the world," Frank used to say. But Frank had died of a heart attack at 68, 7 years ago. All those plans, all that time they thought they had, vanished in a single afternoon. Now Maggie was the one with time, but everyone seemed to think she didn't know how to use it anymore. The Social Security office was crowded and noisy. Maggie took a number and found a seat between a young mother with a crying baby and a man about her age, who kept checking his watch and sighing loudly. When her number was finally called, she approached the window with her manila folder clutched tightly in her hands. "Good morning," she said to the clerk, a tired-looking woman about 40. "I need to resolve an issue with my Medicare coverage." "ID and documents," the woman said without looking up. Maggie opened her folder and felt her heart sink. The papers were damp. The rain had somehow gotten into her purse, and the ink on several forms was smudged and running. The letter from Medicare was barely legible. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "The papers got wet in the rain." The clerk looked up with barely concealed annoyance. "Ma'am, I can't process wet documents. You'll need to request new copies and come back." "But I've been waiting for over an hour." "I'm sorry," but there's nothing I can do. Next, Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks. The people behind her were shifting impatiently. She gathered her damp papers and stepped aside, feeling foolish and small. Outside, the rain had stopped, but her mood hadn't improved. She walked the 4 blocks to the bank, her shoes squelching with each step. At least she still had her pension check. That was in the inside pocket of her purse, safe and dry. The bank was quieter, more civilized. She approached the teller, a young man with a friendly smile. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" "I'd like to deposit this check, please." She reached into her purse, then the other pocket, then back to the first pocket. The check wasn't there. She opened her purse wider, digging through receipts, tissues, and loose change. No check. She checked her jacket pockets, then her pants pockets. Nothing. "Take your time," the teller said, but she could see other customers lining up behind her. "I had it when I left the house," she said, more to herself than to him. "I put it right in my purse." Her voice was rising slightly with frustration and panic. Behind her, she heard someone sigh loudly. "Some people shouldn't be handling their own finances," a woman muttered to her companion. Maggie's cheeks burned. She turned around to face the line of impatient faces. "I'm not senile," she said, her voice stronger than she intended. "I just misplaced something. It happens to everyone." The woman who had spoken, middle-aged, well-dressed, gave her a patronizing smile. "Of course, dear. We understand." That word, dear, from a stranger half her age, delivered with such condescending sweetness, made something snap inside Maggie. "Don't you dear me," she said, her dispatcher voice emerging, the one that had commanded respect in airport towers for 3 decades. "I guided aircraft through storms when you were probably still learning your ABCs. I've handled more complex problems in a single shift than you'll face in a month." The bank had gone quiet. Everyone was staring. The young teller looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am," the woman said coldly, "there's no need for hysteria." Hysteria. The word hit Maggie like a slap. Not anger, not frustration, not righteous indignation, hysteria. The catch-all diagnosis for any woman who dared to express strong emotion, especially an older woman who refused to shrink apologetically into the background. "Would you call it hysteria if a man your age defended himself?" Maggie asked, her voice deadly calm now. "Or would you call it assertiveness?" 3 weeks later, Maggie attended her grandson's soccer game. She'd driven herself there, something Linda had been questioning lately with increasing frequency. The parking lot was crowded, and she'd had to circle twice to find a spot. As she approached the bleachers, she saw Linda talking animatedly with other parents. Maggie waved and started walking toward them, but something in their body language made her pause. "Just worried about her living alone," Linda was saying to a woman Maggie didn't recognize. "Last week, she called me 3 times in one day because she couldn't remember if she'd taken her blood pressure medication." "Have you looked into assisted living?" the woman asked. "My mother-in-law fought it first, but now she loves it. So much safer." "I've been researching places," Linda replied. "The hard part is getting her to admit she needs help. She still thinks she's 35. Maggie felt invisible, as if she were watching a conversation about a stranger. They were discussing her life, her future, her capabilities, and she wasn't even part of the discussion. She approached the group, her heart pounding. "Hi, Linda." Her daughter startled, then quickly composed herself. "Mom, you made it. How was the drive?" "Fine," Maggie said, but she could see the other parents exchanging knowing looks. The look people give when they're dealing with someone they consider fragile. "This is my mother, Maggie," Linda said to the group, and Maggie caught the subtle emphasis on mother, as if she needed to be categorized, labeled, explained. The conversation shifted to safe, surface topics, the weather, the soccer season. How nice it was that Maggie could still make it to games. Still, as if her presence was a temporary gift that would soon be revoked. When Maggie tried to contribute to a discussion about the school's new reading program, offering insights from her volunteer work at the Literacy Center, the woman Linda had been talking to smiled politely, but quickly changed the subject back to soccer. By halftime, Maggie realized she'd become the invisible elderly person in the group, spoken about but not to, included but not heard, present but not truly seen as someone with valuable thoughts and opinions. She was furniture with feelings, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be engaged with. The final blow came during a visit to her doctor's office the following month. Dr. Peterson had been her physician for 15 years, but lately, their appointments felt different. "How are we feeling today, Maggie?" he asked, not looking up from his computer screen. "I'm feeling fine," she said. But I wanted to discuss something. I've been having some memory concerns, and I think I'd like to explore some testing options. Dr. Peterson finally looked at her, but his expression was one of gentle condescension. Well, Maggie, at your age, some memory changes are perfectly normal. Are you still living alone? Yes, and I'm managing just fine. But I'd like to be proactive about my health. Have you talked to your children about maybe getting some help around the house? There are wonderful senior services available. Meal delivery, housekeeping, someone to drive you to appointments. Maggie felt her energy spike, the same energy that had carried her through decades of high-pressure work, through raising children, through caring for a dying husband. But Dr. Peterson seemed to interpret her engagement as agitation. I don't need those services, she said firmly. I cook for myself. I drive myself. I take care of my own home. What I need is information about cognitive testing, so I can make informed decisions about my health. Now, Maggie, let's not get worked up, Dr. Peterson said in the tone one might use with an upset child. I think what would help you most is to slow down a bit. Maybe consider reducing some of your activities. Are you still volunteering at that literacy center? Yes, and I love it. The coordinator says I'm one of their most effective tutors. Well, perhaps it's time to step back from some of these commitments. At your age, you should be taking it easy, not running around like a 20-year-old. There it was again, that assumption that energy and engagement at 75 was somehow inappropriate, even pathological, as if her vitality was a symptom to be treated rather than a strength to be celebrated. Doctor, I'm not worked up or running around like a 20-year-old. I'm being an engaged, active adult who happens to be 75. There's a difference. Dr. Peterson made a note in her file. I'm going to prescribe something to help with anxiety, and I really think you should consider having someone check on you daily. Your daughter mentioned she's concerned about you living alone. Maggie stared at him. You've been talking to Linda about me? Without my permission. She's listed as your emergency contact. She's just worried, Maggie. We all are. The prescription pad came out. Anxiety medication for a woman whose only symptoms were refusing to act helpless and insisting on making her own medical decisions. The final insult in a pattern that had been building for months. Her energy and independence reframed as problems to be solved, symptoms to be medicated, behaviors to be contained. She took the prescription but didn't fill it. Instead, she drove home and sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the photos of her life, and finally understood what had been happening to her. It wasn't memory loss making her feel helpless. It wasn't age making her feel invisible. It was a society that had decided energetic, opinionated elderly women were inconvenient, inappropriate, and needed to be managed rather than respected. But she was done being managed. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Had she just thought about putting it in her purse? These days, the line between thinking about doing something and actually doing it seemed to blur more often than she cared to admit. Would you like to sit down for a moment? The teller asked gently. Maggie looked at his kind face and felt tears prick her eyes. This was it. This was what everyone had been waiting for. Proof that she couldn't handle her own affairs anymore. She'd lost important documents, forgotten her umbrella, and now misplaced her pension check. She was becoming exactly what everyone expected a 75-year-old woman to become. Helpless, confused, a burden. No, thank you, she managed. I'll come back when I find it. She walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk, unsure of what to do next. The sun had come out, making the wet pavement steam. People hurried past her, busy with their important lives, and she felt invisible and forgotten. This was the feeling she'd been fighting against for months. This sense that she was disappearing, becoming irrelevant, losing the capability that had defined her for so many years. When she was younger, she'd been the one people came to for solutions. She'd raised 2 children largely on her own, while Frank worked long hours. She'd managed the household budget, organized family gatherings, remembered everyone's birthdays and anniversaries. She'd been capable, reliable, strong. Now she couldn't even keep track of a piece of paper. As she walked slowly toward the bus stop, something caught her eye. There, stuck to the bottom of a lamppost by the wet sidewalk, was a familiar blue envelope. Her pension check. She peeled it carefully from the post, checking for damage. It was damp but intact, still readable. She must have dropped it getting off the bus, and the rain had plastered it there. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by embarrassment. How many people had walked past and seen it? Did they know it belonged to the confused old lady who couldn't keep track of her things? Excuse me, are you all right? Maggie turned to find a woman about her own age, standing nearby. She was well dressed, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence Maggie remembered having once upon a time. "Oh yes," Maggie said quickly. I dropped something." "I saw you at the Social Security office earlier," the woman said. "I was sitting across from you. Terrible place, isn't it? I've been fighting with them for months about my late husband's benefits." "Your documents got wet too." "Worse. I brought the wrong forms entirely. Third trip this month." The woman laughed, but not unkindly. "I'm Eleanor, by the way. Eleanor Martinez." "Maggie Lincoln. Would you like to get some coffee, Maggie? There's a nice little place around the corner, and I could use the company. Dealing with bureaucracy always makes me want to either cry or start a revolution." Maggie found herself smiling for the first time all day. Coffee sounds wonderful. The cafe was one of those new places with minimalist decor and complicated menu boards, but Eleanor navigated it like a pro. She ordered for both of them, 2 coffees, black, and a slice of lemon pound cake to share. "The secret," Eleanor said, settling into their booth, "is to never let them see you sweat. I learned that in 43 years of teaching high school, teenagers can smell fear from a mile away, just like bureaucrats." "You were a teacher?" "English literature. Retired 15 years ago, and I still miss it sometimes. What about you?" "I was an airport dispatcher for 32 years at Reagan National." Maggie paused, her voice growing quieter. "Then I stayed home when my husband got sick. He died 7 years ago." "I'm sorry. Mine passed 2 years ago. Lung cancer." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee. "People keep telling me I should move to one of those senior communities, but I'm not ready to give up my independence yet." "Yes," Maggie said, more emphatically than she'd intended. "Everyone acts like turning 75 is some kind of surrender." She hesitated, then added, "But honestly, Eleanor, sometimes I scare myself." "What do you mean?" Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "In my job at the airport, I coordinated flight schedules, managed air traffic communications, tracked weather patterns. Lives depended on my attention to detail. I never missed anything. Never. I had backup systems for my backup systems." She gave a shaky laugh. "My coworkers used to joke that I was so controlling, I probably color-coded my grocery lists. And now I can't remember where I put my umbrella. I lose important documents. Today I panicked because I thought I'd lost my pension check." Maggie's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "What if it gets worse? What if I'm driving and I forget which pedal is the brake? What if I leave the stove on and burn down my house? What if—" Eleanor leaned forward, her expression serious. "Maggie, listen to me. You're catastrophizing. Yes, we all forget things as we age, but you're not losing your mind." "How can you be so sure?" Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "When you've spent your whole life being the person everyone could count on to remember everything, to keep everything organized, to never make mistakes, when that starts slipping away, who are you anymore?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said something that made Maggie's blood run cold. "Have you talked to your doctor about this? There are tests they can run, you know. Early detection is important." The word tests hit Maggie like a physical blow. She'd been trying so hard not to think about that possibility, the one her family had been dancing around in their careful conversations, the one that turned ordinary forgetfulness into something much more frightening. "I know I have it," Maggie managed. "I keep telling myself it's normal aging." "It probably is," Eleanor said gently. "But wouldn't it be better to know for sure? My friend Janet put off getting checked for 2 years because she was scared. When she finally went, it turned out she just had a vitamin deficiency. Simple fix." But Maggie heard something else in Eleanor's tone, a careful neutrality that suggested not all stories ended so well. "What if it's not simple?" Maggie whispered. What if I'm becoming exactly what everyone expects me to become?" Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then you'll face it with the same strength that got you through 32 years of keeping planes in the air safely. But you can't let fear paralyze you. That's not the Maggie Lincoln who never missed a detail, is it? My daughter keeps sending me brochures for assisted living places. Just in case, Mom, she says. But I still drive, I still cook, I still do my own laundry. I may forget where I put my keys sometimes, but I remember every line of Shakespeare I ever taught." They talked for over an hour. Eleanor had traveled to 12 countries since retiring. She volunteered at a literacy center and had recently started taking pottery classes. She'd also forgotten her umbrella that morning, left her grocery list at home twice last week, and once called her grandson by her son's name. The thing is, Eleanor said, everyone our age goes through this stuff. But somehow when you're 75, every little mistake becomes evidence that you're losing your mind. Exactly. When I was 40 and forgot something, I was just busy. Now I'm showing signs. Signs of what? Being human. Eleanor laughed. My memory isn't what it was at 30, but my judgment is better. My reflexes are slower, but my patience is greater. I may not remember what I had for lunch yesterday, but I remember every important moment of my 75 years. When they finally parted ways, Eleanor pressed a piece of paper into Maggie's hand. My phone number. Call me if you want company for your next battle with the bureaucrats. On the bus ride home, Maggie's mind raced with Eleanor's words. Tests. Early detection. The phrases echoed in her head like air traffic control warnings she used to monitor. Urgent, demanding attention, impossible to ignore. For 32 years, she had been the calm voice in chaos. When storms diverted flights, when mechanical failures created emergencies, when hundreds of passengers' lives hung in the balance of split-second decisions, she had been unshakable. Controllers had trusted her completely because Maggie Lincoln never forgot a call sign, never mixed up altitudes, never lost track of aircraft positions. But now she couldn't even keep track of her umbrella. The worst part was the loss of control. In the airport tower, she had systems, protocols, backup plans. She knew exactly what to do in every situation. But with this creeping uncertainty about her own mind, there was no procedure manual, no emergency protocol. Just the terrifying possibility that the very thing that defined her, her sharp, organized, utterly reliable mind, might be betraying her. Back at home, she hung up her coat and stared at the umbrella hanging right there in the hall closet. How had she missed it that morning? She'd looked in this exact spot. Or had she? The doubt crept in again, insidious and cold. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table to plan her next day. She'd return to the Social Security office with her dried documents. She'd deposit her pension check. She'd call Eleanor and maybe suggest they tackle their government paperwork together. There was strength in numbers, after all. But first, she had an idea. Maggie went to her bedroom and pulled out the old shoebox from under her bed. Inside were hundreds of photographs from the 1980s. Pictures of her and Frank at parties, family vacations, ordinary moments that had seemed so insignificant at the time. There was Frank in his members-only jacket, looking ridiculous and handsome. There was her own younger self, with that terrible perm everyone had in 1984. There were her children as teenagers, all attitude and awkwardness. She'd been thinking about these photos for months, but hadn't looked at them because they made her too sad. Tonight, though, they made her smile. Look at all they'd survived, the fashion disasters, the hairstyles, the music they'd thought was so cool. The 80s had seemed like the height of sophistication then, but now they looked charmingly dated. Time had a way of putting things in perspective. She found her old photo albums and began arranging the pictures chronologically. This was something she could do. This was a story she could tell. Maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe memory wasn't just about remembering yesterday's lunch. Maybe it was about preserving the important things, the moments that mattered. As she worked, Maggie realized something had shifted inside her today. The helplessness she'd been carrying around for months felt different now. Not lighter, but more defined. Eleanor had given it a name, a shape, a possibility that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Maybe not knowing was worse than knowing. She picked up a photo of herself in her dispatcher uniform from 1987, standing proudly beside the control board that had been her domain for over 3 decades. That woman had faced every challenge head-on, had never backed down from difficult situations. Maybe it was time to channel that strength again. Yes, she'd lost her documents and her check and her umbrella. Yes, she'd felt embarrassed and small. But she'd also solved her problems, made a new friend, and confronted a fear she'd been running from for months. The old Maggie Lincoln, the one who had guided aircraft safely through storms, wouldn't let uncertainty ground her now. She wasn't the same person she'd been at 30 or 50, but she wasn't meant to be. She was 75, with all the wisdom and experience and, yes, limitations that came with that age. But limitations weren't the same thing as helplessness. Her phone rang. It was Linda, calling for their weekly check-in. "Hi, Mom. How was your day?" "Actually," Maggie said, looking at the photos spread across her kitchen table, "it was challenging, but I'm proud of how I handled it. I met a new friend, I'm starting a project, and—" She paused, feeling something powerful welling up inside her. And I'm going to call Dr. Peterson tomorrow to schedule some tests. Tests. Linda's voice sharpened with concern. Memory tests. It's time I stopped running from my fears and faced them head-on. You know, honey, I spent 32 years guiding aircraft through storms. I never let fear keep me from doing what needed to be done. I'm not going to start now. There was silence on the other end, then Linda's voice, thick with emotion. Mom, I'm so proud of you. After they hung up, Maggie sat back in her chair and felt something extraordinary happening inside her. The fear was still there. It probably always would be, but it no longer controlled her. She thought about all the pilots she'd guided safely home over the years, how she'd been their beacon in uncertainty, their steady voice when everything else was chaos. Maybe that's what she needed to be for herself now. She stood up and walked to her bedroom closet, pushing aside old clothes until she found what she was looking for, her framed dispatcher certification from 1975. She carried it back to the kitchen and propped it up against the wall, where she could see it while she worked. Margaret Lincoln, Air Traffic Control Dispatcher. She read aloud. Certified to coordinate aircraft movements, ensure flight safety, and maintain situational awareness under all conditions. She was still that woman. Older, yes. Different, certainly. But still her. Maggie pulled out her phone and called Eleanor. When her new friend answered, Maggie's voice was stronger than it had been all day. Eleanor, it's Maggie. I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. I'm going to make that doctor's appointment. But I was wondering, would you like to volunteer with me at the Literacy Center? You mentioned you work there. I'd love that. But what made you change your mind so quickly? Maggie looked at her dispatcher certificate, then at the photos of her life spread across the table. I realized something. For 32 years, I helped people navigate through uncertainty. I guided them when visibility was poor, when conditions were dangerous, when they couldn't see their way clear. I never abandoned my post, no matter how challenging the situation became. She picked up the photo of herself in uniform again. I'm not going to abandon my post now either. Whether these tests show something serious or just normal aging, I'm still the pilot of my own life. And pilots don't ground themselves because of a little turbulence. Maggie Lincoln, Eleanor said warmly, you're going to be just fine. After hanging up, Maggie felt a transformation unlike anything she'd experienced since Frank's death. The scared, shrinking woman who had started the day feeling helpless and invisible was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, not despite her age and limitations, but because of everything she'd learned from him. She returned to organizing her photos with new purpose. Each picture told a story of resilience, of challenges met and overcome. The woman with the terrible 1984 perm had navigated the tech revolution at work. The young dispatcher had broken barriers in a male-dominated field. The wife had cared for a dying husband with grace. The widow had learned to live alone without losing herself. And now, the 75-year-old woman would face whatever came next with the same courage that had carried her through decades of storms. She found a photo she'd forgotten, herself on her last day of work, surrounded by younger colleagues who had learned from her expertise. One of them had given her a plaque that read, "To Maggie Lincoln, the calmest voice in the storm. Thank you for bringing everyone home safely." Next to it was another photo that made her heart skip. Herself at 17, wearing a kimono she'd borrowed from the drama department for the school's International Culture Day. She'd been so proud of that costume, had spent weeks learning about Japanese tea ceremony to present to her classmates. Mrs. Henderson had rolled her eyes and called it more silly foreign nonsense. But Maggie's eyes in that photo were bright with wonder and possibility. Why had she let one teacher's narrow words echo in her head for 58 years? Suddenly, an idea sparked, wild, impractical, and absolutely thrilling. She walked to her computer, the one Linda had insisted she learn to use 3 years ago, and typed Japanese language classes for seniors. Pages of results appeared. Online courses, community college programs, conversation groups. Her heart began to race the way it used to when she was coordinating multiple aircraft during rush hour, focused, energized, alive. She clicked on one link, then another. There was a beginner's class starting next week at the community center, just 20 minutes away. And there, she could hardly believe it, was a website for Japanese calligraphy supplies, with beginner sets and instructional videos. For the first time in years, Maggie felt the stirring of that 17-year-old girl who had dreamed of visiting cherry blossom festivals and learning the ancient art of brush painting. Mrs. Henderson had been wrong. Those dreams weren't silly. They were part of who she truly was, buried under decades of practical choices. She'd been bringing people home, safely her whole life. Now it was time to bring herself home too. Not to some diminished version of herself, but to the full, complete person she had always been and would always be, regardless of what tests might reveal. Maggie Lincoln was rising like a phoenix from the ashes of her fears. And more than that, she was rising from the ashes of other people's expectations. The hysteria they diagnosed in her wasn't hysteria at all. It was life force. It was energy. It was the refusal to disappear quietly into the background, just because she'd reached a certain age. She thought about the woman in the bank who had called her hysterical, the parents at the soccer game who had spoken about her as if she weren't there, Dr. Peterson, who had tried to medicate her vitality. They had mistaken her passion for pathology, her strength for symptoms. But now she understood. There was nothing wrong with being energetic at 75. There was nothing inappropriate about having opinions, making demands, refusing to shrink. The problem wasn't her energy. It was a world that didn't know what to do with women who refused to become invisible. She was still flying, still navigating, still guiding. Only now, she was her own most important passenger, and she was done letting other people decide her flight path. She smiled and reached for the next photo, then paused to write herself a note. Doctor's appointment tomorrow. Volunteer at Literacy Center. Call Eleanor about tackling Medicare forms together. Sign up for Japanese class. Order calligraphy supplies. Remember, you are still the calm voice in the storm, and it's never too late to chase the dreams that make your heart sing. She looked at the photo of her 17-year-old self in the kimono, then at her dispatcher certification, then at the pictures of Frank and her children. All the different chapters of her life spread out before her. For years, she thought her story was winding down, that the best parts were behind her. But maybe she'd been looking at it all wrong. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the practical, responsible Maggie Lincoln finally made peace with the dreamy, curious girl she'd once been. One where Mrs. Henderson's voice was finally silenced by the sound of brush strokes on rice paper and the gentle rhythm of Japanese phrases rolling off her tongue. She had work to do, a life to live, dreams to resurrect, and absolutely no intention of landing until she was good and ready. The girl who had once been called silly for loving foreign cultures was about to become a 75-year-old student of life, and she couldn't wait to see where this new adventure would take her. If you enjoyed Maggie's inspiring story of resilience and strength, don't forget to like and subscribe for more uplifting content about aging gracefully and finding purpose. As a bonus, don't forget to watch this video